Lincoln Hall was sitting upright in the snow at 28,200 feet, barefoot and smiling, when climbers found him 12 hours after his own team had declared him dead. His wife Barbara had already started planning his funeral in Australia. His expedition insurance had been cancelled. His climbing permits had been transferred to his next of kin. But there he was on May 26, 2006, on the northeast ridge of Mount Everest, looking up at strangers with blackened fingers and saying, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." He had no boots, no gloves, no oxygen tank, and no memory of surviving the night in conditions that kill most people in minutes. His body temperature had dropped to just 79 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 26 degrees Celsius, technically alive, clinically frozen. His heart had slowed to 5 beats per minute. Yet somehow, Lincoln Hall had refused to die. The 50-year-old Australian mountaineer had spent 14 hours alone in the death zone, where the human body literally begins consuming itself to stay alive. The temperature was -52 degrees with 70-mile-per-hour winds. The effective wind chill was -90 degrees. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes solid in under 5 minutes. Hall had been sitting exposed for 12 hours with no shelter, no heat source, and no protection from the wind. His team had checked his pulse, found nothing, and left what they believed was a frozen corpse. But Hall's body had performed a medical miracle that doctors still cannot fully explain. This is the story of the only person in Everest's history who was declared dead and lived to tell about it. But his survival would destroy his family, bankrupt his future, and ultimately kill him. 6 years later, the mountain had given him back his life, but it had also begun the slow process of taking everything else away. Lincoln Hall was 50 years old and one of Australia's most experienced high-altitude climbers. He had attempted Everest twice before, and failed both times. This third attempt was supposed to be his final chance to stand on top of the world. He had trained for 2 years, spent $40,000, and left his family behind for 2 months. On May 25, 2006, he finally reached the summit at 2:30 in the afternoon. But summiting Everest is only halfway done. The real challenge is getting back down alive. Hall's problem started 4 hours after he reached the summit. He was descending the northeast ridge when his oxygen ran out at 28,200 feet. His Sherpa guide, George Marep, tried to share his own oxygen tank, but Hall was already showing signs of severe altitude sickness. His movements became clumsy, his speech started slurring. He began taking off his gloves and boots despite the -40-degree temperature. Hypothermia was shutting down his brain, and his body was entering the final stages of high-altitude cerebral edema. By 9 o'clock that night, Hall had collapsed completely. He was lying in the snow, unconscious, his breathing so shallow that George couldn't feel it through his thick gloves. The Sherpa checked Hall's pulse at his wrist and found nothing. He pressed his ear against Hall's chest and heard only silence. Hall's skin was blue-gray, his lips were black, and his eyes were fixed and dilated. Every medical sign pointed to death. George had seen dozens of climbers die on Everest, and Lincoln Hall looked exactly like all the others. The decision to leave Hall's body behind wasn't made lightly. George and the other Sherpas spent 3 hours trying to revive him. They slapped his face, shook his shoulders, and poured warm tea down his throat. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, temperature was dropping to -50 degrees, and the wind was picking up to 60 miles per hour. The Sherpas were running out of oxygen, their headlamps were failing, and frostbite was creeping into their fingers and toes. They had to choose between saving themselves and staying with what they believed was a dead body. At midnight, that made the radio call that would destroy Barbara Hall's world. "Lincoln is gone," he told the base camp coordinator. "We could not save him, he is dead." The news reached Barbara at their home in Wentworth Falls, Australia at 7 in the morning. She had been awake all night, waiting for updates about her husband's descent. Instead, she got the call that every climbing spouse dreads. Her husband of 28 years was dead on a mountain 13,000 miles away, and his body would never come home. But Lincoln Hall wasn't dead. His body had entered a state that doctors call profound hypothermia, where the heart beats so slowly and weakly that it becomes almost impossible to detect. His core temperature had dropped to around 75 degrees, low enough to stop most bodily functions but not low enough to kill him completely. His brain was still alive, just barely, running on the last reserves of oxygen stored in his blood. He was essentially in a coma, suspended between life and death in a way that only happens at extreme altitude. What happened next defied every medical textbook about hypothermia and high-altitude survival. While his team was descending the mountain and his wife was planning his funeral, Hall's body began a process that doctors still don't fully understand. His heart rate gradually increased from 5 beats per minute to 15. His breathing became deeper and more regular. His core temperature started rising, degree by degree, powered by metabolic processes that should have shut down hours earlier. By dawn, he was conscious again, though he had no memory of the previous night. Don Mazza found Hall at 7:30 the next morning during his own summit attempt. Mazza was leading a team of 3 climbers up the northeast ridge when they spotted what looked like a body sitting in the snow. They approached carefully, expecting to find another frozen corpse to add to Everest's grim collection. Instead, they found a man who was very much alive, though clearly in serious trouble. Hall was sitting cross-legged in the snow, his jacket open, his boots missing, his hands blackened with frostbite. He looked at Mazza and said, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." Hall had no memory of the previous night. He didn't know where he was, what day it was, or how he had gotten there. He thought he was still climbing toward the summit, not descending from it. He had removed his boots and gloves during the night, a common sign of severe hypothermia called paradoxical undressing, where the brain's temperature regulation system becomes so confused that victims feel hot instead of cold. His feet were frozen solid, and his hands were so badly frostbitten that he couldn't use his fingers. But he was talking, breathing, and remarkably cheerful for someone who had just spent 12 hours dying. Mazza faced an impossible choice. He had trained for 15 years to climb Everest, spent $60,000 on the expedition, and was only 3 hours from the summit, but he was also looking at a man who would certainly die if left alone. Hall couldn't walk, couldn't use his hands, and had no protection from the wind and cold. The ethical code of mountaineering is clear. You don't leave a living person behind, no matter what it costs you. Mazza made the decision that would save Hall's life and end his own summit dreams. He turned his team around and began the most difficult rescue in Everest's history. The rescue took 14 hours and involved more than 20 people. Mazza's team had to carry Hall down the most dangerous section of the northeast ridge, across loose rock and ice that could avalanche at any moment. They had no rescue equipment, no proper stretcher, and no way to communicate with the teams below. They moved Hall 50 feet at a time, taking turns carrying him piggyback style across terrain where a single mistake would kill everyone involved. Hall drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes helping with the rescue, sometimes fighting against it, his brain too damaged to understand what was happening. The most dangerous part of the rescue happened at the first step, a vertical rock wall at 28,000 feet. The team had to lower Hall down a 40-foot cliff using climbing ropes, with no margin for error. If the ropes failed or if Hall fell, he would tumble 2,000 feet down the north face of Everest. The rescue team was so exhausted that they could barely stand, let alone handle the complex rope work needed to lower an unconscious man down a cliff. They had been above 28,000 feet for more than 18 hours, far longer than any human body is designed to survive. By the time they reached the high camp at 25,000 feet, Hall was barely alive again. The effort of the rescue had drained what little energy his body had left. His pulse was weak, his breathing was shallow, and his core temperature was dropping fast. The camp doctor, who had been radioed about the rescue, was waiting with oxygen, warm fluids, and medical equipment. He took one look at Hall and immediately began treating him for severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, and frostbite. Hall's hands were so badly damaged that the doctor could see exposed bone through the blackened skin. The helicopter rescue from base camp took place 3 days later. Hall was flown to a hospital in Kathmandu, where doctors amputated the tips of all his fingers and several toes. The frostbite damage was so severe that his hands would never work normally again. He spent 2 weeks in intensive care, fighting infections and blood clots that threatened to kill him even after he was off the mountain. His wife Barbara flew to Nepal to be with him, still struggling to understand how her husband had come back from the dead. The medical explanation for Hall's survival involves a phenomenon called the mammalian diving reflex, where the body shuts down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart. When core temperature drops below 80 degrees, the heart can slow to just a few beats per minute. Blood flow redirects to vital organs, and the brain enters a state similar to hibernation. Hall's body had essentially put itself into suspended animation, surviving on stored oxygen and glucose while his temperature slowly stabilized. The process usually kills people within hours, but Hall's exceptional fitness and acclimatization to high altitude gave him just enough extra time to survive. What makes Hall's case unique isn't just that he survived hypothermia, but that he recovered consciousness on his own while still in the death zone. Most people who experience profound hypothermia need medical intervention to rewarm their bodies safely. Hall's core temperature somehow increased naturally, possibly due to metabolic heat generated by his muscles during the night. His body had performed a medical miracle, restarting systems that had been shut down for hours. The process should have killed him, but instead it gave him just enough strength to survive until rescue arrived. The psychological impact of the experience was almost as severe as the physical damage. Hall suffered from severe post-traumatic stress for months after the rescue. He couldn't sleep without reliving the night on the mountain. He had nightmares about being abandoned, about freezing to death, about his family mourning him while he was still alive. The guilt of causing his wife so much pain was almost unbearable. He had put her through the worst experience of her life, making her believe she was a widow when he was actually fighting for survival, just a few hundred feet above where his team had left him. Hall's relationship with his Sherpa guide, Dorje Moret, was complicated by the events on the mountain. Dorje had made the right decision based on everything he knew about high-altitude medicine. Hall showed no signs of life, and staying with him would have killed the entire rescue team. But the fact that Hall survived created a terrible burden of guilt for the Sherpa, who had declared him dead and left him behind. The two men eventually met again years later, and Hall thanked George for making the impossible choice that ultimately saved both their lives. The rescue changed Don Mazur's life in ways he never expected. He became famous for giving up his summit attempt to save Hall, but he also became the target of criticism from climbers who said he had interfered with the natural selection process of high-altitude mountaineering. Some argued that Hall should have been left to die, that the mountain had already claimed him, and that the rescue had set a dangerous precedent for future expeditions. Mazur received death threats from climbers who believed he had violated the unwritten rules of Everest. Hall returned to Australia permanently disabled but alive. He lost the tips of all his fingers and toes, and his hands were so damaged that he could no longer work as a mountain guide. He underwent more than 20 surgeries over the next 2 years, trying to restore some function to his frostbitten extremities. The medical bills bankrupted him, and he struggled with depression and survivor's guilt. He had achieved his dream of climbing Everest, but the cost had been almost everything else in his life. The story of Hall's survival spread around the world, becoming one of the most famous rescue stories in mountaineering history. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of high-altitude climbing. If Hall could survive at night, in the death zone, how many other dead climbers might have been saved if their teams had stayed longer? The incident led to new protocols for determining death on Everest, requiring multiple checks over several hours before declaring someone beyond rescue. The changes came too late for the dozens of climbers who had been left behind over the years, but they might save future lives. The medical team that treated Hall in Kathmandu was baffled by his survival. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the lead physician, had never seen hypothermia this severe where the patient recovered consciousness without medical intervention. Hall's brain scans showed oxygen deprivation that should have left him in a permanent vegetative state. His blood work revealed chemical imbalances that typically cause immediate cardiac arrest. Yet Hall was awake, talking, and joking with nurses, despite enduring conditions that kill most people within minutes. The rescue footage captured by Don Mazur's team shows how close Hall came to dying during the descent. In the video, Hall slips in and out of consciousness, his head lolling back as the team carries him down the mountain. At one point, he stops breathing entirely for nearly 3 minutes. The rescue team performs CPR at 27,000 feet, an almost impossible task in the thin air. When Hall finally starts breathing again, he opens his eyes and asks where his boots are, with no memory of his heart stopping. Hall's frostbite damage was so severe that doctors initially planned to amputate both hands and feet. The tissue was completely black, with no blood flow detectable below his wrists and ankles. But over several days, circulation slowly returned to parts of his hands and feet. The doctors were amazed to see dead tissue turn pink and start healing. Hall's body was performing another medical miracle, regenerating blood vessels and nerve connections destroyed by the cold. The cost of Hall's rescue was enormous. The helicopter evacuation cost $40,000. Medical treatment in Kathmandu cost $60,000. Follow-up surgeries and rehabilitation in Australia cost more than $200,000 total. Hall's insurance company initially refused to pay, arguing that mountaineering wasn't covered. The legal battle over medical costs lasted 3 years and nearly bankrupted his family. Hall's children struggled with the aftermath in unexpected ways. His daughter, Sarah, 15 at the time, developed severe anxiety about her father's safety. She couldn't sleep when he traveled, convinced he would disappear again without warning. His son, Michael, 12, began having nightmares about the mountain. The children had experienced their father's death and resurrection, and the psychological impact lasted for years. Hall never climbed again. The physical damage from frostbite made it impossible for him to grip climbing holds or feel his footing on rock. But more than that, the psychological trauma of the experience had destroyed his love for the mountains. He had spent his entire adult life climbing, guiding, and teaching others to love the vertical world. The mountain had given him everything, and then it had taken everything away. He spent his remaining years writing about his experience, trying to help other climbers understand the true cost of pursuing dreams in the world's most dangerous places. The final irony of Lincoln Hall's story is that his survival almost killed him. The rescue process, the helicopter flight, the medical treatment, and the long recovery all put enormous stress on a body that was already damaged beyond repair. He died in 2012, 6 years after his resurrection on Everest, from complications related to his high-altitude injuries. His heart, which had refused to stop beating in the death zone, finally gave out in a hospital bed in Sydney. He was 56 years old, and he had spent every day since Everest living with the consequences of those 12 hours when he was supposed to be dead. His wife Barbara said that Lincoln died twice on Everest. First time was when hypothermia stopped his heart on the northeast ridge. The second time was when the mountain began the slow process of killing him that would take 6 years to complete. But in between those two deaths, he had lived a life that was impossible according to every medical textbook ever written. He had come back from the dead at 28,200 feet. sat up in the snow, and smiled at strangers who thought they were looking at a ghost. For 12 hours, Lincoln Hall had been the only living person in the history of the world who had been declared dead on Mount Everest and lived to tell about it.